Hello. So welcome to this live Q&A session with Matt Friedman. So thank you a lot to Matt for this very thoughtful presentations on these very important issues for this very challenging time that all of us are facing globally. The COVID-19 with the number keep rising globally. And with this situation, I think we have many audience who ask a number of questions during this live Q&A session. So welcome to this live Q&A sessions, Matt. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Yes. So I think without further ado, as we have a list of many questions, so I think I will just go one by one, and then you can see what you will be able to answer or expand on the explanations that you already did your presentation. So I think the first questions came up with that with the pandemic, most of the affected domain is the economic empowerment. Many women and their families have been laid off or their source of income have been stopped. What can we do to help the women and children not to be re-trafficked because of these situations? How can we strengthen our economic empowerment program to aid the urgent needs of our survivors?
Well, as I indicated in the presentation, a lot of people are disenfranchised as a result of COVID. We're seeing this all across the region and the world as well. As rightly pointed out, women are disproportionately affected by this, either as workers or as kind of individuals within families that have to make ends meet during this time of struggle. So one of the things, and I will talk from the Mekong Club's perspective, that we've been trying to do is to work with the brands, the major companies that work with manufacturers in countries like India and Bangladesh, to help them to understand exactly what's happening on the ground. And so part of what we're doing is collecting from NGOs, from community-based organizations, feedback on the experiences that these women are having. And then what we're doing is we're getting in front of these companies and saying, as a result of you not paying for orders, or as a result of not being able to kind of move forward with factories, this is the real life experience that we're seeing on the ground in these locations. And so I think it's really important for the private sector to understand the implications of what's happening. And in my presentation, I talked about how we're trying to create a bridge or a dialogue between community-based organizations, NGOs, and the private sector. On a given monthly basis, we're in front of 20 different companies. This includes banks, manufacturers, retailers, hospitality sector. And as a result of having access to them, we are able to pass along these stories. And I think this helps them to understand that they have a responsibility, and they have kind of a mandate in a sense to help these people out, partly because many of their profits over the years came from these individuals. And at a time when they need help, corporations need to get involved. And so we're trying to get this message across, and this is part of what we're trying to do during this very troubling time with COVID affecting nearly all of us around the world.
Wow. That's really helpful, Matt, to expand about this responsibility on the private sector in this particular situation, which is really challenging time. The next questions that coming in is that has the lack of customer allowed some traffic girls to be free? Interesting issues.
Well, what we've seen in a number of locations related to sex trafficking is a situation where if customers aren't coming, then nobody is basically offering services. And so as a result of this, this has resulted in some of the women being sent home. Others, however, find themselves in a situation where they become more indebted, and the brothels and the sex establishments have actually increased their burden. So while the customers aren't coming now, the idea is that they will have to, in the future, pay back even more money. As a result of the indebtedness that we're seeing in some locations, we are seeing that daughters are being presented as collateral for payment of debt. And we expect that this will increase all over the world. So, you know, I mean, in this particular situation, this desperation will result in an increase in sex trafficking for sure. And we're beginning to see signs of that now.
Oh, that's great. The next questions which coming in is that the audience hoping that you will be able to touch on the impact overall for freedom businesses and social enterprise. So do you see any impact on these two important topics? Yeah.
Well, I think what we're going to see is that there is going to be a need for us to change the way we look at the work that we do. For example, the Mekong Club as an organization has spent a lot of time working with the private sector to help them to do social audits, to identify what workers need, what their situations are, what needs to be addressed. As a result of not being able to physically go to these sites, what we see is there is a need for new innovative ways of approaching this. For example, we have an app called the Apprise app. It basically has been modified and changed in order to allow for workers themselves to answer a series of 30 or 40 questions related to what's actually happening on the ground with them. And the way it works is on the screen of the phone will be various maps. And these flags indicate where a person might come from. They are asked to press the flag. Once they do that, in their language, a video comes on and basically says, we have a series of questions we want you to answer. The questions will be used for the following purposes. You can choose to do this or not do this. If the answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. And then they go through these questions. And so this is presently being tested in a number of locations. And it was only developed because what we needed was more ways of kind of reaching out and tapping into what's actually happening within the real world with workers. What are their experiences? What are their needs? What are their fears? What are their aspirations? What are their problems? All of those things need to be addressed. And so finding ways of adapting is extremely important. In addition, we've developed for kind of the hotel industry, the manufacturers and the banks, a checklist or a series of checklists that help them to identify how they can be responsible when it comes to addressing workers within their supply chains and their businesses. And so what the checklist does is it gives them helpful suggestions on how to be responsible, how to move in the direction of being a business with purpose, a business that demonstrates that even though they themselves may be going through something, they recognize that they have to go beyond themselves and support the individuals that have helped them to get to where they are now.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting aspect, because I think as you mentioned that most of the time we see that the private sectors are like aiming for profit maximizations. And when we look at like freedom business and social enterprise, they're kind of like closely connected to the communities, and then they are working with the communities, and how this, I think, the COVID-19 actually impacted them in one way or another, and how they would be able to respond to that or helping the communities. I think this is like something that's, I think, very interesting. Yeah. The next question is, how had the COVID-19 pandemic changed the landscape of human trafficking in the supply chain?
Well, I mean, you have had organizations, manufacturers, retailers that have been spending years trying to refine and improve kind of their direct support to workers to ensure that exploitation isn't taking place. For example, emphasizing responsible recruitment, trying to ensure that workers don't have debt, ensuring that there's freedom of movement and that overtime isn't compulsory, and that if it exists, it's paid, and that people have the ability to leave and their documentation isn't taken. As a result of COVID, we're seeing that a lot of the advances that have been made are disrupted significantly. Now, whether it'll bounce back to what it was in the past remains to be seen. We are hearing, for example, in some locations that workers have approached factories to say, we will work for free if you feed us and give us shelter. So what we're seeing isn't a negotiation upward, we're seeing a negotiation downward. So it remains to be seen how all of this will settle in the months and years to come. You know, the World Bank indicated that nearly 500 million people could basically drop into poverty. Now imagine how many years it took to get those people out of poverty. And within a 6 or 7 month period of time, we find them basically slipping back into that kind of a situation. What this indicates is the fragility of the world, the fact that how easily, you know, something like this can destroy all of the gains that we've had over time. And so what I'm hoping, the big lesson when we are able to kind of stop and think about this years from now is how do we prevent something like this ever happening again? Yeah, we have the day-to-day things that we do to protect exploited people, but how do we put in place a plan that looks globally at the world to say, if parameters change, another epidemic comes, if disasters in certain locations take place, how do we collectively as a world take this on and address it so it doesn't disenfranchise this many people? Because we can't find ourselves slipping back into having lost 15 or 20 years of progress because of one major event. We have to be smarter about this, and we have to plan more in the future related to this.
Wow. Yes, I think that's very important. So that, I mean, the work that we have advanced and gained during this past decade will not be disrupted and just gone. And then I think this is very important for all of us here to keep that in mind. The next question is, what do you think about in some cases, the victim have transformed themselves into the other players in the supply chains, becoming recruiters or traffickers themselves? How are we going to mitigate that issues?
Well, I mean, we all know that we can use sex trafficking as an example. A woman and a girl is tricked and deceived, forced into prostitution. She stays within the sex establishment for a while. Eventually, there are less customers, and she moves into management. And she goes from being, you know, the traffic victim to the madam in that particular organization. We see migrants following a similar trajectory, whereby they start off as kind of forced labor victims, and then gradually they become the agents and the recruiters themselves. This scenario has existed for a long time, and you know, what's interesting about it is when the person is a victim, everyone's heart goes out to them. When they switch over to kind of being almost trafficking management, then all of a sudden people are against them, not recognizing that they got into that because of human trafficking. There's a lack of compassion that happens afterwards. I think a lot of it comes down to just constantly getting in front of these populations that could switch over from victim to perpetrator to help them to understand that that isn't necessarily the direction that it should be going in. You know, there are many advantages to avoid something like that. You know, they could be arrested, they could be caught, and more importantly, what they're doing is basically exploiting their fellow citizens and people within their communities, and that's a terrible thing. And so I think just helping them to understand that this is not the direction that they should be going in can sometimes be achieved simply by talking to them, giving a convincing argument, helping them to understand that this is not the direction they should be going in, because it's fraught with all kinds of additional problems. And more importantly, helping them to remember what it was like when they themselves were victims and how they didn't like to be exploited. Why would they want to impose that on somebody else?
Yes, I think that's very important to, raise the awareness about how this would impact, on other people who could have been in these situations and then were themselves in before. The next question is, would like to know the impact on migrant workers around the regions because of this COVID-19.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of impacts that I think we're going to see. For those who got home before the lockdowns, they're struggling with being in a situation where perhaps a lot of money isn't coming in. And so they are struggling to get their food and to cover their board and to avoid debt. Another outcome of a lot of this might be that you may not see these individuals have the opportunity to go to another country for a job. For example, in Macau, we're hearing from the hotels that they are no longer going to seek people from outside of Macau. They're going to offer those jobs to local people. Now, migration has some great advantages. It offers an opportunity for people to make more money than they would in their home country if it's a non-exploitative type situation. So we don't want migration to go away. We just want to make sure it's safe. But when it comes to actually returning to what it was, even a year ago, I think it's going to be a very slow process, partly because people can't even get from one place to another, even if they wanted to. There's all kinds of restrictions and so forth. Another thing we're seeing in Singapore is that many of the people who ended up getting COVID were migrants that were in kind of living circumstances that were very oppressive. And what this has done is shown a light on kind of the fact that there are these people who are disenfranchised, that are being exploited in that culture. Hopefully that will change and will result in some improvements in that type of a situation, but it remains to be seen what that outcome will be.
Yeah, thank you. Just for the audience, I mean, now we have more questions coming in, but I mean, you can send in your questions or comment to the chat box. So I will be reading out for Matt to comment or answers to your questions or comment. Next question is, are there ways and strategies to mitigate the negative impact of COVID to everyone affected in the supply chain? So quite a bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any easy, quick fixes when it comes to doing this. Partly because what you have are the brands, the international companies struggling because they're bleeding out a lot of resources. This results in orders not going forward, which means that factories, the tier 1 factories, aren't assembling things, which means that the tier 2 factories that have the component parts aren't supplying tier 1, and they're basically suffering, and all the way down the line. In addition to that, you have a situation where people who were buying things up until pre-COVID are themselves struggling and don't have money in their pocket to go out and buy things. And so there's very little demand for, footwear and apparel and electronics and various other things in the West. And as a result of that, you're seeing a disproportionate emphasis on kind of protecting each individual business. And so there isn't really a quick fix in this particular case. Now, what we're seeing is that some brands that have been working with factories and supply chains are offering a portion of kind of a contribution to workers to allow for those workers to at least survive during this period of time, with the hope and expectation that this would result in them being kind of taken back when things get better. But there's also a lot of brands that have actually stopped providing any support at all or have canceled orders. And as a result of this, you have factories in certain locations that are not going to survive simply because they don't have the resources or the capital to be able to get through this type of period. So there's this is going to be a very difficult time for supply chains. I think more than anything else, what we're seeing is the resilience of communities, where when migrants come home or when workers come home, the community, the family basically does what they can to support each other. And I'm hoping that this will strengthen kind of communities and families in a way that, they come to realize the importance of familyness or communityness. We get kind of more back to basics in terms of how we all have to be there for each other.
Yeah, that's very important. We have some more questions in the chat box that I will be reading out to you. This one came from Karine. Are you getting a positive response from corporation as you present this grassroots story? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, okay. So part of what we've seen in the past is corporations will not kind of approach the NGO world because they're afraid of being named and shamed. They're afraid that the NGOs will call them out for what they're doing. And, you know, for a long time, that was the approach. You know, if you wanted to get corporations to do things, you had to force them into it. You had to embarrass them. With more of an emphasis on kind of corporations recognizing that they have to be on the right side of the fence when it comes to doing the right thing, there is more receptivity, but the mechanism for community-based organizations and NGOs to talk to them hasn't existed. So we're going to be putting out a survey to as many organizations as we can to basically ask the questions, if you could get in front of the corporations, what would you want to say to them? What would your message to them be? What is the thing that you think would really help them to be able to help you in your work? Because for the most part, community-based organization activities and corporate activities, for the most part, are trying to achieve the same things: a lack of exploitation. Community-based organizations do it because it's what you do and it's in support of communities and everything else. Corporations do it because they want to avoid a situation where it creates a business risk, whether it's a reputational risk or a naming and shaming risk or something. It doesn't matter what the motivation is. As long as we all are working in the same direction, we can come to a conclusion that results in the workers getting what they need to protect themselves. And so this survey will be going out probably beginning of next week. If anyone's interested in kind of answering it, it'll only take somewhere between 7 and 10 minutes so that you can get your points in front of the banks and the businesses we work with. Just let us know. You can contact us directly through the Macon Club, or you can contact us through this webinar series. I think it's extremely important for us to find relationships with the private sector because they have a tremendous network. They can reach lots of people. They have lots of resources. They know how to problem solve. And as a result of us working with them, we've been able to address modern slavery using them as custodians as part of this process. And I think we should take advantage of that more in the future.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent help for Mekong Cup to help being the bridge between the civil community-based organization and grassroots with the private companies and big corporations. The next question is, what would you suggest for awareness raising with consumers given potential loss of income and attention priorities, maybe focus inward or personal issues?
You know, that's a tough one. I mean, the advice that we would give to consumers to help these businesses to move forward is to buy stuff so that we could get back to where we were in the past. I think kind of what happens with COVID, and I talked about this in my presentation, is that we are so focused on the health side of things that we don't see the pain and suffering that goes on as a result of all the changes that have taken place with economies and the crashing of supply chains and so forth. I think we need to find a way of helping the world to become more compassionate, more kind, more understanding, more informed about the implications of when something like this happens, not only to where you are in the United States or Canada or Europe or other more developed countries in Asia, but to people who have for years and years, made the clothes, the shoes, the electronics. So part of what we're really trying to do is to kind of get across to people, there seems to be so much discussion of slavery, and we see it with the Black Lives Matter kind of protests and so forth, looking at historical things, pulling down statutes associated with slavery. The fact that companies are rebranding because they have potentially racially sensitized things. And as a result of all of these things, we keep looking at slavery as if it's a thing of the past. There's 40 million people in modern slavery around the world. 62% of them are in Asia. We need to be focusing on slavery today. And it's often bothered me that we could get people so excited about something that is historical, but at the same time, with all of these people suffering now, we haven't been able to kind of capture the attention of the world to say this is unacceptable. If it's unacceptable in the past, it's unacceptable now. In fact, it's more unacceptable because it's happening on our watch. So I think part of what we really need to do is to help sensitize people to the fact that this is happening. As consumers, we buy things, and that can have an impact on some of these people being in these circumstances. So like global warming, we have a responsibility to understand the issue and to ensure that our governments and our United Nations counterparts and our NGOs and our private sector organizations take this seriously and address it. It's unacceptable and it has to stop. And until we can get people to do that, it's really hard for us to make much of a difference, because the last thing I'll say as part of this answer is we are helping less than 0.5% of the victims around the world. And this has been the case for the last 15 years. We have to do a better job of helping these people.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, to raise awareness on the demand side with the consumers that, I mean, even though, I mean, this COVID-19 impacted on their economies and their personal income, but they have to make sure that they just don't just go out and then try to tell the companies that they want to get things as cheap as possible and don't care about how the companies made those products. And that could result in like modern slavery or other, I mean, human trafficking. So I think that's very important. The next question is that do you have like an example of any business sectors that you find is especially vulnerable in terms of supply chains during this COVID-19?
Well, I mean, hotels are vulnerable because they buy supplies that come from locations that could be tainted by modern slavery. They also have a lot of workers that come out from the outside. And as I say, third-party contract recruitment has the potential to be exploitative if debt is associated and the recruitment agency takes over that debt. We have, obviously, manufacturers and retailers are vulnerable because they have supply chains. Manufacturers tend to have supply chains that have 3 tiers. The top tier is where you assemble things. Second tier is where the component parts come from. And the third tier is where the raw materials come from. Manufacturers have only been looking at the top tier for the last 25 years. They haven't looked at the second and third tiers. The expectations with legislation is that they have to go all the way down, and they don't really know how to go about doing that. And so in addition to dealing with COVID, they also are coming to realize that they have to kind of look at their supply chains all the way from top to bottom. The third group is banks. Banks are concerned about this because $150 billion is generated from modern slavery. If any of that money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering and they get fined. So if a bank is supporting a particular industry and that industry is identified as having forced labor, they can get caught up in that particular scenario themselves. And so we work with a lot of banks that are aggressively attempting to address the issue of modern slavery because they themselves don't want to find themselves on the receiving end of a major fine.
Yeah, I think in this situation, we are all vulnerable, but there are some sectors that may be more vulnerable than the others. So I think that's it's important for us to keep that in mind. I think given the time, I mean, I have the last question here to you, Matt. What actions should be done by global decision makers to prevent increased poverty and unethical business practices due to COVID-19, such as modern slavery? What global regulation are still lacking? So there's like a bigger picture.
Well, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyways. I mean, I've never faced in my 40-year career the amount of a lack of leadership that's existed at this particular time. I just cannot believe the absence of a global response. As I indicated in my presentation, the possibility of starvation is there, the possibility of so many kind of conflicts within countries based on the inability to get medicine, to get work, to get food and so forth is there. We have to, as a world, do a better job. We need to come together at this particular time, even though we are facing our own individual national crises, and look at 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 8 months from now, 12 months from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. We need the world to be doing a better job of focusing on that. There is a real absence, and I don't know if I'm the only one who's experiencing it, but I just don't kind of hear much from, you know, the UN Secretariat, or, you know, the collective G20 and G7 and the Asian ASEAN organizations. We really do need more of a sense of planning. But more importantly, I think all of us as individual human beings have to accept some responsibility for the crisis that exists now. We accept the fact that for this to be fixed, we can't rely just on those people. We can look around to see within our own community, within our own network, what we as individuals can do to help. How can we step up? How can we add value? How can we contribute? How can we donate? How can we be there for people who are suffering? We need to, as human beings, demonstrate compassion and kindness and warmth and consideration for everyone. And there are people suffering everywhere. You know, and it's not just workers in locations. People are suffering because of loneliness or mental health issues, all kinds of other things. Human beings need to take the best of what we have now and run with it. Because I feel like in a situation like this, you have the potential for the worst of what human beings have to offer, or the best to come to the forefront. And I'm hoping that the best prevails, and that we can be collectively there for each other as a community.
Yeah. So I think this last few minutes that I have, so I'd like to give this opportunity to you, Matt, if you would like to have to say something to help us wrap up these sessions.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I'd like to say is that we all recognize that the NGOs and community-based organizations are under tremendous pressure, not only because the need is so great, but because of resources are being used to go to other locations. Many of our organizations are very concerned about funding. Many of our organizations are concerned about when are we going to be able to have direct access to the communities we work with and so forth. The NGO community needs to also unite. And I'm seeing that. Like here in Hong Kong, we have an NGO coordinating group that has come together and worked collectively, and we're seeing that across other locations as well. It's a really important part of the process because, you know, collectively, our voice is much stronger in helping the donors to understand that at any given time, this is probably the most important time to be addressing issues of disenfranchisedness and exploitation of communities and individuals and workers and so forth. So that voice has to be. So, I just want to, congratulate and support and put a shout out for all of those groups that are out there doing this work with limited resources. It's so important. It's so relevant. And it really is going to be the difference between whether or not we get through this and how we get through this in a positive way. So thank you all very much for that.
So everyone, that's Matt Friedman. So thanks, Matt, for sharing your insight with us. This has been very interesting, really thought-provoking, and helping us to understand about the situations and how we will be moving forward. So thank you for speaking at this RF 2020. So everyone, so now I think with this, the end of this live Q&A session, so we're going to have like a lunch break for those who are in the Thailand time zone or around this. But if not, then you can have like a 1 hour break that you can go stretching or grab something to eat or coffee. And I think the session will be back in about 1 hour. So thanks, Matt.
Yeah, and I see a lot of names I haven't seen in a while. I miss you all, guys, from my days back in Bangkok, and I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.